exposing the false seeds that Satan plants into the church. Why? So that we can help each other as believers to avoid deception. 1 Timothy 4:1-2. But the Spirit explicitly says that in latter times, some will fall away from the faith, paying attention. What? Paying attention to what? Deceitful spirits and what? Doctrines of demons. And these will always be through men. So you have believers who are submitting themselves to the ministries of men who are operating by deceitful spirits and teaching the doctrines of demons. And because they're submitting to these men, they're what? Departing from the faith. That is the kingdom philosophy, the belief system, the set of doctrines we have in the kingdom. They're deviating from the way. Hold on. The way. Because of these deceitful spirits and doctrines of demons. And he said, by the hypocrisy of liars, human beings who have been seared in their conscience. So believers are going to be deceived because men masquerading as true ministers, operating by deceitful spirits and teaching false doctrines, are going to lead the believers into deception, into a completely different faith. Matthew 24:11, many false prophets will arise and will deceive many. And another passage says, if even the elect believers. And so if false ministers are going to lead believers into deception, wouldn't it benefit the church if those in the church were calling out those who were leading people into deception? Isn't that just common sense? If there are people in the church masquerading as true ministers, shouldn't we call them out? If you live in a neighborhood and somebody is in the neighborhood stealing things from people's houses, shouldn't we call them out so people can beware and make sure that that person gets convicted? It's common sense. If you work in a company and somebody is stealing the money, shouldn't you expose that person for stealing the money? So why then do we not think that people who are masquerading as true ministers in the church should not be exposed? No, let everyone just worry about their own business. This is our business. Oh, wise one, this is our business. We don't want the believers to be deceived. We love the brethren. It's called Philadelphia, brotherly love. If you love the brethren, you will not want for them to be deceived. If you don't want them to be deceived, whatever influence God has given you, whatever giftings God has given you, you'll use it to help the people who are in your sphere of influence to avoid deception. And as the scripture says, mark those who cause dissension. Mark them. Is this guy IDing them? Jesus was marking the ministers he was talking about. Let me go to Matthew 25. Or is it Matthew 23? Let me show you where Jesus is calling out the Pharisees and the scribes. Machando. Is it Matthew 20? It's not Matthew. Is it Matthew 23? Matthew chapter 23. This is Jesus speaking. Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples. So he's speaking to the crowds and to his disciples, saying the scribes and he's calling them out by name. Now this one is even worse. He's not calling out an individual. He's calling out two distinct religious movements. So remember I talked about false movements. He's exposing a false movement. The scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore, whatever they tell you, do and comply with it all. So the issue wasn't their theology. The theology was sound. But do not as they do, character. For they say things and do not do them. So he's exposing the immoral character of the scribes and Pharisees. And they tie up heavy burdens and lay them upon people's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with much as their finger. And they do all their deeds to be noticed by other people, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments, and they love the place of honor at banquets and the seats of honor in synagogues, and so on and so forth. But I'm just trying to show you that Jesus Christ himself took upon the ministry of exposure and exposing the hypocrisy of the religious leaders of the day. He didn't say, no, these are fathers, let's not talk about them. That's how people teach now. Don't expose the sin of the fathers. No. Jesus, that means you would have been correcting Jesus if he did this in your time. Many of the things people are teaching, you would have not liked Jesus in his day. He was doing the things that you're castigating people for doing now. He's a young minister in his 30s, calling out people who can be senior citizens. These are people who are elderly. These are the elders of the people, scribes and the Pharisees, exposing their immoral character in front of everyone. These are the senior ministers of the days, the papas of the days, the fathers of the days. And Jesus is exposing their false character or their immoral character. and calling them hypocrites. You see, in verse 17 of chapter 23, he says, "You fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold or the temple that sanctifies the gold?" He's calling them fools and blind. Then he says in verse 24, "You blind guides." This is Jesus Christ, who is act like he's a hippie that didn't do anything that offended people. He's calling out senior ministers foolish men and blind guides. That means they're blind leaders. They have no vision. They don't know where they're going. They're not being guided by the Spirit. They have eyes, but they don't see. He's calling them blind guides. Today's modern equivalent would be a young minister in his 30s calling out a minister who is in his 50s that has been serving God for decades and calling out his immoral character. People would get in the comments and say, "Oh, who are you? How many souls have you saved? What have you done?" Young minister calling out people. You would have did that to Jesus, because Jesus doesn't have half the influence they had. These people were commanding all the Israelites to come to one place to worship. These were the senior ministers with authority, with influence, so forth, sitting in the seat of Moses, judging Israel, teaching Israel the law.